Well, the tragedy off the coast of Lampedusa has shocked us all, and it's raised a number of pressing questions: how to avoid such accidents in the future, but also why are people prepared to take such risks to get to Europe? Well, we're going to be speaking to three Eritreans who made their own extraordinary journeys to Europe, and they'll answer your questions about why they were prepared to take a chance to do that. This is how you can get in touch. Our phone number is here. We're also on Twitter, Google+, and on Facebook, so wherever you're watching, you're welcome to get involved.
I experienced.
This is chaos.
People are going to want to know.
Let's just say something.
Well, in the last few minutes, the Italian fire brigade has released more pictures of their rescue operation to try and find the bodies of those people who drowned yesterday off Lampedusa. These are the pictures that we've been provided with. Rough seas have been hampering the work of these divers. There's now no hope of finding survivors. This is about finding the bodies of the victims of this terrible tragedy. These pictures just provided to us by the Italian Fire Brigade. As we get more pictures, of course, and more information about that rescue operation on Lampedusa and off the coast of it, we'll bring them to you. We're also hoping to connect live to a BBC reporter on the island, along with some of the people affected by this tragedy. But first of all, let me introduce you to some gentlemen who can help us understand why people are prepared to take such risks to get to Europe. We can speak to Gwaitum, who's an Eritrean. He now works with the Jesuit Refugee Service in Malta. He left Eritrea in 2005. And Samson joins us. He's an Eritrean migrant now living in the English Midlands, Leicester to be precise. He's a lorry driver. He also left in 2005. And both of you, you're very welcome. We've got a number of questions for you. Let me start with you, Gwaitum. I think a lot of people just want to know, why did you choose to leave?
Thank you. I was born in Asmara. That's the capital of Eritrea, a very beautiful city. First, I would like to underline that it's not easy to leave your country when you don't know where you are going. It's not easy to leave family behind, your people behind. And it's not about getting a better life. For me, a better life would have been to stay in my
Gwaitum, the sound has just dropped out on your Skype. So while we fix that, Samson, let me bring you in. A question here from Wilson in Lagos, who says, what made you so desperate to leave?
First of all, thank you. You have made this opportunity to inform about all the situation of our, especially about young Eritrean people. Then, as you say, the first choice to leave my country because, like all of young people of Eritrea, like we don't have just, they keep us indefinite military service. Secondly, because like our life was very despised, you know, you can't, even the people, when you live, you are not putting any risks to lose your life, because the life in there is very tough time, you know. That's why we left it years ago. Still, the young people still they carry on because the regime in there is not any about. He don't care about our rights. Like a lot of my friends, a lot of my cousins, a lot of people still now, they was in army for years. Like some of them, when we started in first round military service from 1994, still now they are in army. Those people, they are paranoid, you know. Then when they fled the country, they don't put any risks, you know. This tragedy is happening for years. Then we hear it, this tragedy about Lampedusa, but was for years in northern Africa. The body was on the coast of Tunis, Libya for years. But now the media, they can't give a lot of interest because the body is coming to them home. But this our problem was carry on for years. Then
so Samson, let me just jump in here, because the point you're making is a strong one, which is that the life you were leading back home, particularly you say you were asked to do military service, but it didn't end when it was supposed to, meant that you felt there was little to lose by going elsewhere. I've just got a couple of other people I'm going to bring in. Unfortunately, we've not been able to reconnect with Gwyton. When we do, we'll bring him back in. But in the meantime, Michael Collier is here with us from the Centre of Migrant Research at the University of Sussex. Michael, I wonder what your view is on how Europe can better to respond to this desire of some Africans to come to Europe to live and work.
Thank you for inviting me. I think the first thing to bear in mind is, as both Gwyton and Samson have said, this is, for most people, certainly many people, this is not necessarily their first choice. Their first choice would be to stay at home. So there's a range of approaches that, that people refer to in terms of root causes, which improve conditions for people at home. And this is obviously one of the responses that Europe could make in terms of making more profound efforts to increase the political, social and economic conditions in countries such as Eritrea. But there's a second range of responses which is perhaps more immediate, which is what happens once people get in these terribly dangerous boats. That is sadly a fairly common occurrence. And that requires a much quicker, a much more immediate response in terms of direct assistance to people who are in these sorts of dangers.
Stay with us, Michael. We're also joined by Salam Kidane, who's an activist from Eritrea who's living in London at the moment. Salam, I'm sure you have heard many extraordinary stories of Eritreans who have tried to get into Europe.
Oh, yes. I mean, as tragic as this situation is, it's neither new nor unique to us Eritreans. Every year we come across these stories. Everywhere we go, there are Eritreans in such desperate situations, be it in the Sinai Desert, in Yemen, in Egypt, in Sudan. Everywhere you go in the region, Eritreans are facing such situations and disastrous conditions.
And some people are emailing the BBC saying, we sympathise with the situation Eritreans are in, but this isn't our problem. It's not our problem to find homes for you. It's not our problem to provide education for you inside of Europe. What do you say to that?
Yes, exactly. Primarily, it's the problem for us, for Eritreans, and the situation. I mean, these are the symptoms. The shipwreck yesterday, all the us as refugees being here are the symptoms of what's happening in Eritrea. We've got one of the most dictatorial regimes the world has ever seen. It's actually dubbed North Korea of Africa, and yet ironically it's the European Union that's the biggest funder, aid provider to Eritrea. It's the European Union that doesn't seem to be addressing the human rights concerns that we've been raising repeatedly. Both Gwyton and Samson have just said that they wouldn't want to be here. We don't want, I mean, the context to this is Eritreans have fought for 30 years, one of the longest battles the world has ever seen, to free their country, and they would like to be there. They would love to stay there and develop it, but this has been made impossible for us by the regime that is driving its young people out of the country, basically.
And just to explain, the current leader of Eritrea has been the leader ever since independence in 1993. This is a one-party state, and a number of human rights organisations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have been incredibly critical of the human rights record of this regime. Let's just go back to Samson in Leicester, because I think people would be interested to know the risks that you took, Samson. Can you tell us about how you came into the UK? Was it on a lorry, is that right?
Yeah, that basically when I started the journey from Sudan, I crossed all the largest deserts from Sudan to Libya. After that, I met some traffickers to put me in the boat and send me to Lampedusa. Then even we had a lot of problems. I mean, when you think right now is like at that time, because when we left the homeland, we don't have option. We are not any, like, you cannot stay in Sudan because there is no like stability. Plus, you cannot stay in those neighbors. Then when I came to Italy, after Italy again, the things in Italy, you can get like right freedom, but you cannot get stability. Then when I was in Italy, I stayed for a while. Then I cannot get a work. Then I came to France. From France to Calais, then after Calais, then I came through lorry. Even I had a long journey on the just off the lorry for when the lorry is left at Dover. Like I was under the lorry for 5 hours, around 5 hours under the lorry until it was stopping in some warehouses. Then all the risk I put it because of the things I left behind is like I tell, the things we was expecting to get some change, but the things is coming worse and worse. Every young, like I know some of the victims for family security, I cannot mention them name from those victims. I left them when they were 6, you know.
So you took this extraordinary journey, Samson. I apologise for interrupting you, but I'd like to bring in Michael again, because you brought in, sorry, we're going to speak to another guest in a moment. Michael is still there, so let me just speak to you quickly. Michael, when you hear these extraordinary stories, I'm thinking back to the radio edition of World Have You Say I hosted a couple of hours ago, where I heard two arguments. One said target the traffickers. The other said accept these people are going to arrive and do more for them, help them. They need help. Which side of that argument do you come down on?
I would certainly come down on the latter side. I think one of the problems with the target the traffickers argument is that it assumes that traffickers are all large-scale international criminal gangs, and in most cases that's not the case. These are very small-scale operations, in some cases almost humanitarian operations, helping people to get where they want to go, and simply attempting to eliminate them would be a very short-term response, because other organisations would spring up to meet that demand. But responding to people's humanitarian need once they're in that situation is clearly the more urgent, pressing concern. And things like allowing boats which are circulating in the Mediterranean anyway, like fishing boats, to pick people up and return them to the nearest port, which at the moment is very difficult because they risk criminal charges themselves to bringing those people to port. In this case yesterday, we heard that there were, I think, 3 separate fishing boats who reported the difficulties that this boat was in. And we have to ask, why didn't any of them go and assist before it was too late? And the reasons why other boats don't go and assist is because the potential charges they face can be punitive, that there is a real disincentive for them coming to the aid of people in need.
Michael, thank you very much for joining us live from the University of Sussex in the south of England. If you're just joining us, we are speaking to a number of people with an expertise in refugees and migrant labour, but also a number of people who have made their own extraordinary journeys from their own country to Europe. Let's speak to another one who joins us live now. Nesruddin claimed asylum in the UK, but is from Eritrea. And Nesruddin, I understand that you tried to take the boat to Italy 5 times. Tell us about that.
Actually 6 times, in which one time I sank on the sea on 2006, August 16 of 2006. I sank on the sea, and the Libyans, they came and rescued us, and we had to go to prison for trying illegal crossing of, to illegally try to cross here to Europe.
And there's a question here for you from Habesha in Ethiopia, who says on Twitter, were you aware of the dangers of this journey before you started it?
Actually, the journey started in Eritrea, so in Eritrea nobody is aware of anything. But while I was in Libya, yeah, I was aware of the journey, the danger of the journey. But I preferred taking it than staying in Libya, because I was more desperate when I came to Libya than I was in Eritrea.
And here's another question for you from Haider in Thailand, who would like to ask, what was the most difficult part of your journey?
Well, I'll say crossing the sea, yeah.
And what do you say to people who are watching in Europe at the moment, who are contacting the BBC and saying, this isn't your country, this isn't your continent, you shouldn't come here? What do you say to them?
I didn't choose to come here. My first choice was just to live in a country where I can do as I pleased, or as the normal human being would prefer to do, like have my human rights and everything. But when you cross from Eritrea to go to Sudan, and in Sudan, yeah, you become more desperate, and you have to again have to decide to go to another country where you can feel safer. And you cross to Libya as well, and Libya you have another problem as well. So that's how I came to Europe. I didn't choose to come to another continent, as they put it in your, how you said it.
Well, Nasruddin, thank you for responding to that point. Samson and Salam, I'm going to come back and speak to you in a little while. There's a couple of interesting issues here we won't get into in the next section of World Have Your Say, namely that not all people who come to Europe actually set out to end up in Europe. We'll try and understand that a little bit more. And if you are watching in Europe or in East and West Africa, we're particularly keen to hear from you. The number to call, we're live by the way, is on the screen. If you call us up, we'll call you back, or you can just leave a quick message. All that coming up on World Have Your Say in a couple of minutes' time.
No, I actually talking about it. Let me say something. No, I actually talking about it. Let me say something.
I'm Ros Atkins. Welcome back to World Have Your Say. As you'd expect, we're spending the first half of the programme talking about that tragedy off the Italian island of Lampedusa. And we can introduce another guest to talk to about this. Live from Islamabad, Alexandra Facina joins us. She's a photographer and award-winning author too. And Alexandra, you did a particular project when you looked at people going from Somalia to Yemen. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, I actually spent 2 years pretty much on the road following migrants and refugees from the Horn of Africa. Many of those escaping conflict in Somalia, as well as, of course, poverty and famine. And very much like Samson and Nasruddin from Eritrea, and also many refugees coming from areas like Oromia in Ethiopia, escaping from persecution too. Because Somalia, the easiest way is, has the longest coastline in Africa, sorry. And really the main way out for people from there is by sea. There's a big network of smugglers and traffickers who operate boats from there. It's a very, very perilous journey. And when I was working on this, in fact, one in 20 of the migrants and refugees actually died making that journey. They were packed into very, very small fishing boats, usually around 140 to 150 people per boat. The smugglers, in fact, were very, very brutal. I saw people summarily executed, made to kneel down in the sand and shot in the back of the head before they even boarded the boat. Once on board, people were beaten, robbed, raped, often dropped miles from shore, thrown overboard. Many couldn't swim, many drowned, and it's just a very, very difficult journey that they face.
And Alexandra, the journey you're describing, you also photographed. We can, as you're talking, we can pull up some of the pictures that you've given us to show our audience here on World Have Your Say. And one shows a long line of people standing in Azure Sea heading out to a boat. This is where people are boarding the ship, is that right?
Yes, this is in fact taken on the northern coast of Somalia. In an area that the smuggling gangs and often pirates and many criminals use. It's an area that's controlled, in fact, by Al-Qaeda gangs. It was, of course, very dangerous for me to be there, but not nearly as dangerous as for the people making that journey. I did try to follow one group of refugees and migrants. It was about 140 in number. In fact, only 11 of those actually made it across the Gulf of Aden to Yemen alive. Once I was on the beaches of Yemen, I saw countless bodies every single day washing up. My book actually is called A Million Shillings, which refers to the currency of Somalia. And 1 million shillings is actually equivalent to exactly $50 US. And this is what the migrants and refugees pay to the smuggling gangs. And for me, this was really the price of life, that they were willing to risk everything in search of something better for $50 US.
And Alexandra, as you're talking, we're also seeing a second picture of some people arriving in Yemen. And if we move those pictures on once more, we can see one of the maps which you photographed, which shows very rudimentary directions scribbled on a map which people were following in order to head towards Yemen. Thank you very much for speaking to us, Alexandra. Stay with us if you can. I just want to bring Samson in at this point. Listening to Alexandra, Samson, I'm wondering if you can describe what it's like to leave everything behind and put your life in the hands of these traffickers. Were you scared? Did you not have time to think about it? What were your emotions?
On our time was not that tough like those traffickers. I want to clear this journey. Cannot stop. Let's say like me when I left Libya. From one boat they get like from each of us like $1,200 Then we was 200 something people. You know, these people, they made from one boat 250,000.
So that's extraordinary that you were paying $1,200. I wonder, Nesruddin, how much did you pay?
At that time, I paid $1,200.
That's how much you paid, Samson. Nesruddin,
right
1 minute, Samson. Nesruddin, how much did you pay?
The same price, but the thing is, he asked the question, how did he feel? I felt like safer with them smugglers. In this program, you're talking about the smugglers as some gangs who just do bad things, but some of them are actually like a safer to
I want to
us
hear about this in more detail, but I'm being told by my editor that we've made a connection to Lampedusa, and we can only do that for a few moments. So let's immediately bring in my colleague, Julian Migliorini, who's live with us from Lampedusa. Julian, tell me what's happening there.
Well, Ross, it's been a frustrating day for operators here, for the rescue searchers who are trying to recover the bodies from and that are apparently trapped by the boat underwater, scattered around the seabed. Frustrating day also for the people of Lampedusa. I'm joined here by 3 guests. 2 of them are residents of Lampedusa. One of them is a local journalist who has been following the story. Giusy, can I ask you, and Daniela, you are here from Lampedusa. This story has happened several times. Do you feel that this is out of scale? What are your feelings now?
Yeah, it's such a tragedy that, you know, that we have been coping with the problem of immigration for so many years, but we could never imagine that such a nightmare could happen so near to us, so close to our coast. And if you think that we were sleeping quietly in our house and the people were trying to save their life, it's really bad to think. And the only word I can say is what the Pope has just said. It's really a shame. And what's worse is that we can't really do anything to prevent all this to happen. The only thing we can do is just helping them when they come, trying to help them in the better way we can.
Daniela, can I ask you, what do the people of Lampedusa, how do they deal with this problem in your personal experience?
Oh, we become accustomed to all this problem, and so accustomed that is just the normality now. Yesterday was a really big tragedy. Today is the day of sadness. We feel really empty, with the heart completely empty. And we thought that maybe the best was today the silence, so people don't speak so much, and the school was completely empty. Shops decided to remain closed, just to show how the deep is the feelings today.
Do you think this story has been going on for a while now here in Lampedusa? Do you think this will change things? Can you tell me, what do you think?
We hope so. We hope so. It should be a signal that something should change, because yesterday was so close. But what we learn from the past is that this happened a lot of times, maybe fast, but it happened.
Raffaella, you were today at the refugee center where some of these people are. What did you see?
First of all, we journalists, we aren't allowed to go inside the center, but I saw what I knew, that there are so many people, about 1,000 people in a place where about 300 people could be now. And I saw many men and women and children sleeping under the tree.
I'm afraid we have to leave it there. Thank you very much. And as you see, Ross, a frustrating day for people here in Lampedusa and lots of concerns about the future.
Julian, we appreciate you and your guests bringing us up to date. We're going to carry on talking about the many issues that this tragedy in Lampedusa raises. If you want to get involved, you can tweet us on the WHYS hashtag. Back in just a couple of minutes. Welcome to World Have Your Say. We're talking about the many issues that this tragedy off the coast of Lampedusa has raised. If you want to get involved, you're very welcome to. Our contact details are on the screen throughout, and we've had an extraordinary response so far. Comments coming in from Norway, Nigeria, France, South Africa, Tanzania, Kuwait, Ethiopia, Somalia. The list goes on and on. I'll try and get more of your questions into the show in the next few minutes. And in about 10 minutes' time, we'll turn our attention to that government shutdown in the US and hear from some of you there about how you think the politicians should get themselves out of this mess.
Talking about it. Top priority. My experience. This is chaos. People are going to want to know.
Let's just say something.
Of course, lots of discussion about how Europe should respond to the number of Africans trying to get into Europe. A couple of very interesting comments that have just come in. Jakub, an Ethiopian's called up to say the countries of origin of these refugees should work harder to make the life locally better. The West should do more to promote that happening. And an Eritrean caller in Norway who didn't want to give us his name said, Europe has the power to press governments for the rights of people. They have the power to stop this. People are desperate. So a number of African people calling us and saying, actually, the best way Europe can help is to apply pressure back on these particular governments in Africa. I wonder if you agree with that particular analysis. Let's go back to our guests who are joining us live from Islamabad, from Leicester in the English Midlands, and here at the BBC in London. Now, Nesruddin, I interrupted you because we had to go to Lampedusa, and I apologise for doing that. But you were telling me about whether you felt continually in fear when you were making the journey from Eritrea to the UK.
Yeah, I was telling you because the question you asked Samson was how deep in the hands of the smugglers, well, or the traffickers. I felt a bit safer than them, with them because the international community seems to do nothing to the Eritrean influx or the East African migrants. So the only people who can hurt us or help us are the smugglers. So this risk that we were taking while we were in Libya or in Sudan is the only choice we had. So, and they did help us. Some of us, they killed us, and some of us, they helped us to make that journey. And we are here, some of us, and some of them are dead.
And it perhaps illustrates the low ebb that you were at, that you see these people who were killing some of the other people you were with as the best source of security that you could get at that stage.
The only source,
the only source of security. Thank you for correcting me on that. Now, let me just pull up this. There's a columnist in Corriere della Sera, the Italian newspaper, Gian Antonio Stella, writing, says these waves of people coming ashore cannot remain an Italian problem. This issue concerns everyone. And Gian Antonio goes on, just as the mayor of Lampedusa urged the Prime Minister Letta to come out and count the dead with us, so the same cry should be directed at Brussels. And a lot of Italians have been contacting What Have You Say today saying, stop making this our problem. It's a European Union problem. Now, here's another question that's come in from Amira, watching us in Toronto on Twitter. And perhaps all three of you could answer this briefly if you would. What were your feelings when you arrived in Europe? And I suppose the question that I would put to you, Alexandra, what were the emotions you saw when people arrived in Yemen? But just quickly, Nesruddin, how did you feel when you actually realised you were standing on European soil?
To tell you the truth, I was not surprised that I was in Europe because it's like I built the whole Europe and I start living in it. Because the price that I paid to come to this country is, or to Europe is immense. So it's like I was building my house and finally I was living inside the house. I was not surprised.
So it was a return for your efforts. Samson, what about you? What were your emotions when you were in that lorry and you realised that you had made it?
Even was a very tough time, but I was feeling more safe than land that I passed. You know, the most thing I was shocking. At least, you know, like under the lorry to go like 60 miles per hour for 4.5 hours, nearly 5 hours. Just I hold it, no, because I passed all the journey, you know. Then I say, no, come on, it's not going to happen. Just I hold it, you know. Then I feel more safe than I passed away.
We should remind everyone watching, and those of you if you've just switched on, there was an extraordinary story earlier from Samson that when he eventually got to the UK, he then was hiding under the chassis of a lorry, and the lorry drove for 4 hours, as you heard, at 60 miles an hour, 80, 90 kilometres an hour, with him hiding underneath. And as you can understand, his foremost emotion was fear. And what about you, Alexandra? How did people react when they got to the shore in Yemen?
I think most definitely with relief that they'd at least found somewhere where they had a sense of security. But of course, life for many of the Somali refugees is certainly not much better. I mean, they have risked everything to escape rather than staring death in the face at home. But what the result is often not a very satisfactory life. And the last couple of years, I've also been following unaccompanied Afghan minors on the very long and dangerous overland journey to Europe. Many of them don't, in fact, have the kind of expectations that you would imagine. They don't believe that Europe is some kind of paradise. It's a place that they've heard of. And it's often just simply because of a lack of humanitarian space in the region here, and the fact that they're unable to apply for asylum anywhere in Afghanistan, that they actually have to go further afield. And you have to really appreciate just how much risk some of these migrants and refugees are taking to actually reach a place of safety.
Well, I think we do understand that, don't we, today?
Immigration.
But we understand that today just from the stories that Samson and Nesruddin have been telling. 5 hours under a lorry in the UK, 6 attempts to get to Italy by boat for Nesruddin. And those of you watching, keep sending in your questions. Thank you very much. More comments here from Yemen, Switzerland, Qatar, Denmark, Zambia, Sudan, India. We're having an absolutely extraordinary response to this story. Here's a question from Deandra, watching us in Trinidad. Deandra, thank you very much indeed for getting in touch. And Deandra would like to ask you, Nesruddin, why did you want to go to Europe? Why did you go when its economy is not very healthy? There are other choices. What was it about Europe?
She's mistaken in here, because when I was in Eritrea, I didn't decide to come to Europe. I was planning to go to somewhere safer than Eritrea. Then I ended up in Sudan. And Sudan, as I mentioned before, I was becoming more desperate than, because there is no, as the lady was mentioning, there is no any humanitarian aid in Sudan or in Libya or in any, or in Egypt, in any East or Northern African places. So I have to make another decision and continue my journey to Libya. And in Libya, the same problem. I became more desperate than when I was in Eritrea to cross to Italy. Still in Italy, I didn't stay in Italy. I was in Italy for 3 or 4 months because there is no any humanitarian aid even in Italy. So I have to cross to France, and from France to England, which actually I prefer here. So the other question is, why do you come to Europe when the economy is failing? I didn't ask whether the economy is growing, or I just want a place to be safe. And
so that's interesting. It wasn't about work, it was about your safety. And it's also interesting that you say, I didn't set out for Europe. We had an earlier edition of World Have Your Say on the radio, and lots of the Eritrean guests we spoke to said, we didn't set out heading for Europe, we just set out to get out of Eritrea. We didn't have a plan. Now, in I suppose a modern development here, the Pope has been tweeting about the tragedy of Lampedusa. Pope Francis says, and we can see him here, these are live pictures that we've got at the moment of him in the Pope-mobile. Pope Francis said on Twitter, let's pray to God for the victims of the tragic wreck off the coast of Lampedusa. He also called what happened a disgrace. Well, if he's calling it a disgrace, Alexandra, if something is a disgrace, people need to respond to it and change how they're dealing with this problem. What would you like the Italian government and the European Union to do?
One of the first things, I think in Europe there's a lot of talk about immigration and the word immigrants. I think we have to be very careful about that. I mean, what happened in Lampedusa and much of the journeys, the risky journeys that migrants and refugees take by sea, we're looking at mixed migration. Amongst the people that are dead in Lampedusa, it won't just be economic migrants. There's going to be asylum seekers, genuine refugees. We can't just take these people as a whole. There's people there that have absolutely genuine claims that need help.
Alexandra, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Nesruddin and Samson, we appreciate you coming on to share your quite extraordinary stories. Thank you very much to all three of you. If you want to carry on talking about this, of course, we're going to be doing so later on BBC World News and on BBC World Service Radio. We're going to pause for a couple of minutes. When we come back, we'll be talking about that shutdown. It's still going on in America.
No, I actually talking about it. Let me say something. No, I actually talking about it. Let me say something.
I'm Ross Atkins. Welcome back to World Have Your Say. All right, let's talk about the US government shutdown. I think a lot of us didn't think the politicians would actually let it happen. And then a lot of us thought they wouldn't let it go on this long. But we are well into this shutdown now. And Americans are wondering, when are their politicians going to crack a deal on the next budget? Let's talk to three who are joining us live now. We have Rebecca Cinderbrand, Politico's Deputy White House Editor, live in DC. Michael is a Rutgers University student who joins us from a car in New York, which is an impressive effort, Michael. Thank you very much. That might be a first for World, have your say. And Alyssa is a politics student at Marymount University in Virginia. Well, let's start with you, Rebecca. What do you make of this? It's been an extraordinary week. Is there an end in sight?
It has been an extraordinary week, and at this moment, there's no end in sight, in the sense of no one quite knows how this situation ends. No one sees kind of the next step. We had a White House meeting earlier this week where you basically had both sides restating their position face to face, but didn't make any sort of movement or any sort of progress on it. We had an interesting meeting of the Republican conference this morning. John Boehner, actually, the Speaker of the House, started it out by reading letters from school children asking how they'd like to see the crisis in Washington end. And that's kind of the level that we're at right now, kind of this desperate feeling of where's the solution? The House continues to pass these piecemeal bills to fund portions of the government, but those aren't going to go anywhere. And of course, we just got word from the president, from the White House OMB a few minutes ago, saying officially what the White House has been saying for days, if those bills reach the president's desk, which they're not going to because they're not going to make it through the Senate, but if they did, he'd veto them. So looking for, again, some sort of a grand bargain, and at this moment, not seeing exactly where it's going to come from.
And Alyssa, when you listen to all of this, how do you feel about your politicians?
Well, it's very interesting and a unique situation. Definitely some disappointment across the board, but more disappointment definitely pointing to Harry Reid and his Senate Democrats and the president. Definitely a lack of leadership on his part. And it's really unfortunate when you hear things like Harry Reid isn't going to fund, you know, some of the bills that the House is passing to help children get cancer treatments. I mean, it's just really disappointing.
Michael?
I think it's disappointing of the Senate or the congressional Republicans to be holding the government hostage at this point, especially over something that was passed and is signed into law and is being implemented. And I think there's a lot of disappointment across the board with the politicians and their decision-making, their process. My concern primarily is how long this drags out and whether or not this drags out into a larger debate about raising the debt ceiling here in the U.S., and that's something that I think is going to have much further reaching consequences financially, both here in the U.S. and abroad. And it makes the Federal Reserve here in the U.S. and the European Central Bank look all the smarter for continuing their buying of those government bonds.
Well, Michael, let's pick up on that point with you, Rebecca. I think a lot of our viewers would just like to hear, realistically, how long could this go on before it reaches such a point that they have to sort it out?
Well, at this point, we're already hearing from leadership in the Senate that they would like to see, that they're going to see, those two crises that Michael was talking about kind of join together, both the discussion over the budget and the government shutdown and the discussion over raising the debt ceiling. Of course, that deadline coming up very quickly, October 17th. And so the sense is not that they want to come to a resolution on one crisis only to have another one even larger staring them in the face. And the question right now, it really comes down, honestly, to the Republicans in the House in the sense that Speaker Boehner knows, and the White House keeps kind of trying to hammer this home, that at this point, given the number of kind of nervous Republicans, particularly those in the Northeast and the Midwest, if the Speaker were to put a so-called clean bill on the floor, that is, a bill funding the government that doesn't include any provisions about the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare, that would likely make it through with a majority Democratic votes, along with some of those nervous Republicans or Republicans kind of frustrated over what they see. But he's committed to not putting that kind of bill on the floor until he can get the support of a majority of his conference. And so that's where we stand right now.
And it's a pretty complicated place to stand. I want to talk about that level of complication with the other two in a moment. But first of all, a number of you have been uploading videos for us to play on this subject. This is Michael in Rhode Island. Let's see what he has to say.
My message to Congress and the president would be that they need to get their act together. We, the American people, chose to vote for them and to put them in office. They didn't just walk into the White House one day and say, hey, I'm here for the job, and they got it. No, we, the American people, elected them into office, and now they have the nerve to sit here and go on the media and say that they're going to negotiate, or they won't negotiate on this fact, or that they won't do this, or that they won't do that. We, the American people, don't want to sit here and listen to these cries back and forth from Republicans and Democrats. Instead of going on the media, instead of standing at podiums day after day saying, what they will do or what they won't do. We don't want to hear this childish bickering. You need to get behind closed doors. You all need to talk together around the table like an adult and come to a conclusion.
Michael, thank you very much indeed for that. Well, while we were watching that, let's introduce you to another guest who's joining us. Chris Bedford, editor and columnist with the Daily Caller, also vice chairman of a Conservative student group. Now, just a moment ago, Chris, we got an excellent briefing from our guest from Politico on the complexities of where we are. Do you think there's a risk here that all Americans across the political spectrum just tune out of Washington, D.C., give up on it?
Certainly, there's definitely a risk of that. I think that congressional approval ratings are at the lowest they've ever been. There's not a lot of faith in Washington, D.C., and it's definitely, the way this shutdown is playing out is different from previous shutdowns because the media landscape has changed and Americans are unhappy with the Senate, they're unhappy with the House, and they're unhappy with the presidency.
And while that's going on, and Michael, let's bring you in live from your car in New York. Do you find that the complexities of the whole process alienate you, alienate your friends from actually what's happening?
Yeah, I do. I do think they alienate a lot of people, and I think there's also a good bit of misinformation out there. And I think people are just tired of the bickering. They're tired of the back and forth. But I think what we're experiencing now is a real fundamental ideological battle over smaller government versus bigger government versus what each side is going to be demanding of each other. And that's why, personally, I don't see an easy resolution to this, like I said, especially as it continues to drag on. And so the complexities most definitely alienate individuals and people who, frankly, just don't want to deal with it.
Michael, sorry to talk across you there. Alyssa, let's bring you in. Can you make a case for American politicians? Do you think they are doing their best? They just aren't agreeing?
I think so. I think that definitely more effort can be made across party lines and to kind of get this taken care of in a faster time frame. But I do think that it's very hard to do so when, you're right, there are party lines. It's an unavoidable subject in American politics. You know, you have the Republicans who really don't want Obamacare, who want to get serious about the debt limit and the debt ceiling. And then you have the Democrats who just want to get this bill enacted and start to cover people with their insurance, but the plan is very flaky, in my opinion.
Well, and you're right that that is a
you're
right that that's a priority for President Obama, because when he spoke in the Rose Garden a few days, he talked more about Obamacare than he did about the budget. Just a quick question to you, Chris. How do you assess President Obama's performance? He's stuck to his guns so far.
Yeah, stuck to his guns, but we just had a breach. He had a breach in his security when the White House told Wall Street Journal they think they're winning. They don't care how long the shutdown lasts. I think it's surprising how poorly his communications team has done in his second term. And he's going into this a lot weaker than in previous battles he's had with the Republicans. I think with the NSA scandal, with Benghazi, with this constant hammering on the presidency, folks are more cynical about him. And when they see the cemeteries of Normandy being shut down, they see World War II Memorial being shut down, they see officers in charge of Iranian sanctions being shut down, but they see the Andrews Air Force Base golf course and gym held up by essential employees. I think he's a more...
Chris, I'm just going to jump in here because we're right up at the end of the programme, but I think one of the interesting points will be, presumably, this whole saga will be, to some extent, be defined by how it's resolved. All three of you, thank you very much indeed. We'll speak to you next week on World Have Your Say. Thanks very much for all of your comments. Goodbye.
Let me say something.